Welcome everybody. Wow, now the lights are really on. If you imagine before the invention of electric light, as soon as the lights went down, people just lived with candles. Difficult to meet. If you watch the movie Barry Lyndon, they made it, all the indoor scenes at night, they only used candles, and it actually gives you a good idea of how gloomy things were. So thank God for electricity. Welcome everybody in person and online. My name is Ahmed Shamsi. I'm chair of Middle Eastern Studies, and it's my great honor to welcome all of you to the first Franklin Lewis lecture in Persian literature in the academic year 2024 to 5. And without much further ado, I want to ask our much appreciated Professor for Persian language, Pune Shaban Jadidi, to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Professor Al-Shamsi. Thank you, Sarah, the department manager, and Salma, the administrative coordinator, for making this event possible. So welcome to the 5th lecture in the Franklin Lewis lecture series that was launched in the winter quarter of 2023 through a generous gift by an anonymous donor. Frank, as you all know, was a prolific scholar of classical and modern Persian literature. His magnum opus is Rumi, Past and Present, East and West, The Life and Teachings of Jalaluddin Rumi. That was published by One World in 2008. His unpublished PhD dissertation, Reading, Writing, and Recitation, Sanai and the Origins of the Persian Ghazal, which he completed at the University of Chicago in 1995, is still one of the authoritative references in the field. In addition to his many contributions to classical Persian literature, he translated modern Persian novels, like Zoya Pirzad's Things We Left Unsaid, published by One World in 2012, novellas like Muhammad Ali Jamalzade's Masume Shirazi, 2013, and short stories like In a Voice of Their Own, stories by Iranian women written since the 1979 revolution, that he co-edited and translated some stories with introduction and annotated bibliography. He also translated modern Persian poetry, such as poems by Sohrab Sepehri. He has several unfinished manuscripts as well, such as Life and Letters of an Iranian Communist, Stories of Bozorg Alavi, which is an introduction to the life of Bozorg Alavi, with an anthology of short story translations. I hope one day his students will complete his unfinished works. The Franklin Lewis lectures so far were delivered by current leaders in the Persian literary studies, whom you all know, Professors Paul Ozensky, Dick Davis, Sunil Sharma, and Dominic Parviz Bruksha. Their lectures all focused on classical Persian literature. But today, Professor Nasrin Rahimieh, an authority on modern Persian literature, will talk about Frank's other passion, that is, modern Persian literature, especially works by women writers. Professor Nasrin Rahimieh is Howard Baskerville Professor of Humanities and Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of California, Irvine. She is currently the director of the Humanities Core Program at UCI, former chair of the Department of Comparative Literature between 2016 and 2019, and former Masih chair of and director of the Samuel Jordan Center for Persian Studies and Culture, 2006 to 2014. Her teaching and research are focused on modern Persian literature, including the literature of Iranian exile and diaspora, and contemporary Iranian women's writing. Among her publications are Oriental Responses to the West, comparative essays in select writers from the Muslim world, published in 1990, Missing Persians, Discovering Voices in Iranian Cultural History, published in 2001, Forough Farrokhzad, Poet of Modern Iran, Iconic Woman, and Feminist Pioneer of New Persian Poetry, published in 2010, that she co-edited with Dominic Parviz Brukshaw, and Iranian Culture, Representation and Identity, published in 2015. She translated the late Taqiyya Madarisi's last novel, The Virgin of Solitude, 2008, from Persian into English. She graciously accepted to contribute a chapter to our latest volume with Professor Franklin Lewis and Asghar Said Ghorab, The Art of Teaching Persian Literature. Her chapter is entitled The Politics of Teaching Modern Persian Prose Fiction Written by Women, which I recommend to all of you to read if you have not done so already. Her current project is on contemporary Iranian women literature. She has published numerous articles and book chapters on women representations in modern Persian poetry and prose, as well as Iranian cinema. Today we are honored to have Professor Nasrin Rahimieh share with us her research in this year's Franklin Lewis Lecture Series. Please join me to welcome Professor Nasrin Rahimieh to talk about Iranian women writers and the question of reader responsibility.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I'm truly honored to be here. I want to thank Sarah, Salma, and the department for helping, assisting, organizing this thing, because I know how much work goes into simple things like travel arrangements, hotels, and so on. So I'm really grateful. It is truly an honor for me to be here and to speak in this wonderful lecture series in honor of our late colleague, Frank Lewis. It's been very emotional for me to be on this campus because I think back to the times when I came to University of Chicago and Frank was always here. He's really greatly missed by all of us in the field as a friend, as a colleague, generous colleague, and I'll never forget his sweet smile. So thank you for letting me speak in this context. I framed this presentation around the question of our responsibility as readers of contemporary Iranian women's writing because of my interest in interrogating the assumption, albeit implicit, that to read fiction produced by women writers in Iran today is to decipher women's agency and or subjugation in contemporary Iran. My interest in challenging this logic of binarism stems from being expected to probe women's fiction for how they represent women's lives in Iran today. The supposition that fiction mirrors contemporary reality is frequently coupled with a desire for understanding whether Iranian women writers express resistance against or conformity with the Islamic Republic's misogyny. What I'd like to focus on in this presentation are examples from fiction authored by contemporary Iranian women writers in which female characters assume different persona or fictional constructs of self. My aim is to explore the significance of such deliberate acts of embracing different persona for a move away from reading for the positionality of the author, conflating the voices of fictional characters with that of authors. I'll focus my analysis today on a novel by a contemporary writer, Belghis Soleimani, a dastanak, a flash fiction, also by Soleimani, and a short story by Ferishteh Sari. But before turning to the analysis of these fictional works, I'd like to share an experience I had some years ago when I was invited by a group of feminist Iranian American activists to speak at one of their gatherings about Iranian women's literature. I was a little reluctant because I'm not an activist myself, but I accepted the invitation and gave a presentation on contemporary works of literature produced by women, which was a disaster and a thorough disappointment to my audience. Hopefully I won't repeat it today. But anyway, the disappointment stemmed from my failure, or perceived failure, to pinpoint forthright expressions of opposition to the Islamic Republic's systemic curtailing of women's rights women's rights. One of the comments directed at me at the end of my presentation encapsulated the audience's frustration. A woman pointed out that based on what I had presented, Iran today was bereft of the likes of Forough Farrokhzad, this iconic poet, Simin Daneshvar, the first female novelist, and by extension, bold visionary female writers who exemplified opposition to tyranny. There are many levels on which this comment can be deciphered, including rhetorical and aesthetic expectations, to say nothing of our collective nostalgia for a time in the past. What I registered most palpably at the time was the desire on the part of an audience frustrated with Iran's institutionalization of misogyny and its apparent power to withstand all manner of opposition. We can think back to the heightened hopes associated with the women life freedom movement as the most recent manifestation of women's public opposition to the theocratic regime's surveillance and control of their bodies and public appearance. In that moment, at this presentation, it was difficult for me to say much beyond saying, yes, yes, I get it, you're disappointed. And yet, I was and remain disinclined to shift the burden of our collective frustrations with the Islamic Republic, however understandable it might be, onto women writers. I would like to dwell for a moment on the implications of expecting Iranian women writers to speak unambiguously against the regime bent on their subjugation. It goes without saying that women writers, like their male counterparts, face censorship and must clear many hurdles to get their works published. The desire for women writers to speak unequivocally about their stance on the Islamic Republic is itself reminiscent, to me at least, of the pre-revolution tendency to conflate writers and intellectuals. Writers were expected to be intellectuals. They were the vanguards of society. And additionally, to expect them to act as vanguards of socio-political change. We believed, my generation read poets thinking, aha, they're going to find and lead the way out of this political morass. As I reflected on my own disinclination to require Iranian women writers to speak to the theocratic regime's subordination of women, I found productive resonances in Roshanak Khishti's review essay, which is entitled, Can the Memoirist Speak? Representing Iranian Women, Gender and Sexuality in Recent Popular and Scholarly Publications. That's the long title. Invoking Gayatri Spivak's famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Khishti asks, and I'm quoting, what of the circumscribed task of the female Iranian intellectual? Haunted by echoes of Orientalism, contemporary forms of Islamophobia, and a complex of overlapping patriarchies, she is dealt a heavy burden of representation. Oh, end of quote. Khishti underscores what she calls the overdetermined signifier of the veil, which assumes agency-less veiled women under the thumb of overbearing Muslim men. While Khishti's focus is on memoirs and a wide range of feminist scholarship, her concern about the possibility of escaping the burdens of representation that reduce Iranian women to either injured, abjected, or liberated through Western modernity is a reminder that our position as readers of works of fiction produced in Iran is inflected by memories of and hopes and desires for a home we, those of us in diaspora, no longer inhabit. As critics and scholars, we too can fall prey to ways of reading that inadvertently displace the works of fiction produced in Iran onto imaginary ideological and political battlegrounds for a projected better future. Faced with these challenges, how do we stay attuned to what works of fiction offer, not as mere reflections of complex realities that engender them? A central question we might turn to is, what is the function of an author in relation to the fictions she creates? We could recall Roland Barthes' famous essay, The Death of the Author, or Michel Foucault's What is an Author, as foundational ways to think about the function of the author. For Barthes, I quote, "A text is made of multiple writings drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation, but there's one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader. Not hitherto said, the author. The reader is the space on which all quotations that make up a writing are inscribed without any of them being lost. A text unity lies not in its origin, but its destination," end of quote. Like Barthes, Foucault posits the concept of écriture, writing, which he envisions as, I quote, "concerned with neither the act of writing nor the individual, be it a symptom or sign of a meaning someone might have wanted to express," end of quote. Beginning and ending his essay with echoes of Beckett's famous "What does it matter who's speaking?" Foucault takes for granted the disappearance or death of the author in criticism and philosophy, but argues that the consequences have not been fully examined. I quote from him, "A certain number of notions that are intended to replace the privileged position of the author actually seem to preserve that privilege and suppress the real meaning of his disappearance," end of quote. What Foucault calls for in the end is to question to stop worrying about who really speaks and what part of his deepest self did the author try to communicate. Such consideration might seem a little far-fetched in the Iranian context, but they offer us a path towards shifting the focus from the writer to the writing. Along with Foucault's critique of privileging the author of a work, other theorists have raised questions that complicate the positionality of an author. How viable is the expectation for authors to account for themselves in their fictional narratives? How feasible is such a process? Let me turn briefly to Judith Butler's giving account of oneself, whose focus is philosophical, I grant, and does not necessarily pertain to fiction. Nonetheless, the insights she offers are well worth pondering in relation to the demands we make of Iranian women writers. I quote from Butler, "Although we are compelled to give an account of our various selves, the structural conditions that account will turn out to make a full such giving impossible. The singular body to which a narrative refers cannot be captured by a full narration, not only because the body has a formative history that remains irrevocable by reflection, but because primary relations are formative in ways that produce a necessary opacity in our understanding of ourselves," end of quote. What I'd like to emphasize in Butler's analysis is the necessary opacity that accompanies any subject's self-understanding. I recognize that transposing this idea onto the sphere of Iranian women's writing can run counter to a history that has placed a heavy burden on women, be it as the self-sacrificing mothers of the nation and wives and guardians of an imagined cultural, religious, or national authenticity, or I would add to these the cult of the author. I grew up with that in Iran, that leans heavily toward reading text through the lens of biography. In fact, not long ago, I was confronted with a situation in which I was asked to account for one of the writers I'll be discussing today. I was approached by a colleague interested in translating one of Belghis Soleimani's novels. This colleague was concerned about the possibility that Belghis Soleimani might be related to the infamous Qasem Soleimani. She had been told that they shared the birthplace and a last name, therefore must have filial relations. She wondered if the possibility of being related to Qasem Soleimani changed my appreciation of Belghis Soleimani's works. She referred to the author's photographs, which showed her wearing her Rusari headscarf, that in a way that signaled, for those of us who know Iran, her strict observance of the hijab rules. Well into the conversation, I realized that this colleague was looking for an affirmation that a possible family relation to Qasem Soleimani made Belghis Soleimani suspect and thus not worthy of being translated. The answer I provided echoed Foucault's by shifting the focus to Soleimani's fictional works and what they might evince about female subjectivity, its mutability and openness to misinterpretation. My interest in Soleimani's works stems from her playful engagement with questions of identity. Interestingly, in her novel, Ruz Khargoosh, Day of Rabbit, some of the questions my colleague raised about Belghis Soleimani's appearance surfaced within the realm of fiction, poking fun at the very photograph that my colleague found suspicious. There's a moment in the novel, Ruz Khargoosh, when the protagonist, Azin, attends a meeting of a book club where the author, Belghis Soleimani herself, shows up, or is invited to speak. Before the writer arrives, Azin has already formed an opinion of her based on the photograph printed on the back cover of the book. I quote from the book: "I take the copy of Welcome to Hades," which is an actual title of one of Soleimani's books, out of my bag, and for the nth time look at the picture on the cover. A chador-clad woman walking along a dusty, unpaved street. Ever since I first saw this book, I have had no doubt that the woman in the picture is Miss Soleimani herself. Beneath the chador radiates a current of life that envelops the entire street. This clashes with the content of the book, which is about death and destruction. My first question to the writer, Belghis Soleimani, is, why this picture? Why this design? End of quote. The narrator's dislike of the photograph on the back cover of the book is rooted in her disdain for what she believes the author represents. I quote, this is from the novel. "This Belghis Soleimani looks like a fat turtle that has placed her entire village on her back and carries it from place to place. I don't know how she can write novels when she has such provincial ways, when she lacks a city dweller's mindset, when her work is filled with village relations. I don't consider her works novels. She's a writer of autofiction. She has written about the life of Golbanu, Nahid, Rudabe, and to be fair, she hasn't done it badly, but she has not written a novel. The novel is the product of a city and relations with between city dwellers. It is supposed to pertain to the complex psyche of a city dweller and the life of the city, not to narrate the tales of Kulsum Nane. I don't have to translate that, but a common woman. End of quote. Azin's unfavorable impression of Miss Soleimani, who is the writer in question, is solidified when she listens to her speak about the subject of her novel. I quote, "The writer begins again with a discussion of her generation's experiences and nightmares and says that she sees herself holding a mirror up to the 1980s generation. This writer belongs to the group of people who cannot shed the burden of historical experiences. This is what I told her the last time I saw her, and she accepted it and told me that until she deals with this burden, she cannot write about individuals and ordinary people. And that is the burden of the 1980s, the massacres of prisoners, etc. As the writer speaks, Azin, the narrator's mind, wanders, but this does not stop her from judging Miss Soleimani and her works. When her attention finally turns back to what the writer is saying, she learns that Welcome to Hades, the work being discussed, is about destruction due to aggression from inside and outside, and she wonders why she had not grasped this point herself, but quickly concludes that Miss Soleimani has failed to communicate this clearly in her novel. She asks the author, "Excuse me, do you think the story has succeeded in conveying this message?" Azin, the narrator, is not prepared for the answer the writer gives, which unapologetically states that the readers are best positioned to answer that question, and that as a writer, she's done her best. In other words, shifting the focus back to the reader. Azin's desire for fixed meaning is curiously at odds with her own penchant for embracing different persona and reveling in the blurred boundaries of her own identity. Now, Azin is the character narrator in the novel. One of her means, Azin's means of livelihood, is to pick up passengers for a fare on the streets of Tehran. She conceals as much as reveals about her own identity to people she encounters as a driver. She adapts her public persona to the situation in which she finds herself in her car. As a cab driver, sort of a cab driver, she becomes accustomed to the range of issues her female passengers like to talk about. And needless to say, observing Iran's requisite gender segregations in public sphere, she prefers to have female passengers. Ready for a possible discussion of Tehran's traffic and air pollution, Azin has purchased an inhaler she doesn't need, but she keeps handy for the right occasion to use as a prop to assist her performance of being an asthmatic who nevertheless has to make a living exposing herself to Tehran's notorious air pollution. If the topic of discussion then moves to the inflation, to Iran's inflation and the country's economic woes, Azin, the driver, has a bundle of torn and grimy banknotes she grabs and waves at her passengers, exclaiming, "This is all the money I earned since this morning." An empathetic passenger assumes that Azin is the breadwinner for her household, which entices Azin to expand her fiction. I quote, I wish it were only household expenses. I have a married daughter at home, and I don't have the means to buy her a trousseau to send her off to her own home." End of quote. She promptly gets hold of a receipt, presumably for a refrigerator she claims to have bought for her daughter, and she bemoans the fact that she owes a third payment on it that she cannot make. She has mastered this role so well that even though she hands off the receipt to the backseat passengers, she knows they will not look at it and verify if it's for a refrigerator. Like the inhaler, the receipt is a prop for the roles she plays. Her play acting prompts one of the passengers to ask about her husband. And Azin once again launches into a story she has fabricated for such occasions. I quote, "My husband died 6 years ago. We spent 2.5 years going from one doctor to another, from one hospital to the next. We ended up selling even the carpet we sat on. But he was not meant to live. He died, and he found peace. I was left with 3 fatherless children. If my brother had not given me this beat-up old car, we would have died of hunger." End of quote. Azin is rewarded for her expert performance. The front seat passenger leaves her extra money and asks the use it. It's not the fare, but I'm sorry about your circumstances. Throughout this segment, Azin appears to be more enthralled by the role she's playing than any pressing financial needs. She's a divorced mother. She has her son living with her. She doesn't need the money. She does this just for fun. I'd like to turn to another example from Soleimani's works that further complicates the questions of identity. The story, in Persian Dastanak, is called Naji, Belghe Soleimani, and I. As suggested by the title, this is a first-person narrative in which Soleimani herself is a character again, as is the deceased fellow writer. It draws on the motif of the doppelganger, a replica of a living being whose appearance connotes one's imminent death. In Soleimani's story, the news of the existence of her double, or at least a deceased one, is conveyed to her by friends who have seen her name inscribed on a grave in Lahijan in northern Iran. Because this is a relatively short piece and I want to draw on specific aspects of it, let me turn to it. It was, and I translated this in honor of Frank Lewis for a special volume in Adabiyat. It was 2007 when Mujtaba Pur Hassan called me from Rasht, the capital of my province, Gilan, and asked anxiously about my health and mentioned that someone named Belghe Soleimani is buried next to Bijan Naji, a real writer, in Lahijan. I listened to Pur Hassan, concealing my anxiety. The same year, Pegah Ahmadi, also a known person, told me about this Belghe Soleimani's grave next to Naji's, noting her surprise at the similarity of our names. In September 2008, I had occasion to pay a visit to my namesake's grave in Lahijan and to check things out for myself. Out of mischief and perhaps furtiveness, I chose an evening for my visit. I wanted to have a unique experience to fill the void of my midlife. When I parked my car alongside the cemetery's hedge festooned with wild blackberries, I got a whiff of the familiar smell of cemeteries and took this as a good omen for my visit. I asked the blue-eyed old custodian for directions to Naji's grave, a famous writer. Having paused long enough to study my face, the old man told me how to get there. The cemetery was quiet and cold. I didn't hear any crows, nor was I startled by a mother's wailing for a lost child. I found Naji's grave easily. I sat cautiously by the grave, placed my index finger on the gravestone, and said a prayer for the soul of the creator of the collection of the stories, and that this is a real collection, the cheetahs who have run with me. All the while, I felt as if a woman resembling me was standing at a distance and giving me a sardonic and menacing look. I knelt next to the black granite of the tombstone and placed my hand where hers would be buried and said a prayer for her. But I couldn't focus on the prayer. I felt as if This Belghei Soleimani, resting under the granite, was playing games with me. For a moment, I felt as if she withdrew her hand from under mine. I stood up facing the gravestone and asked, "How are you, Belghei's Jun?" This informality disrupted everything. Belghais disappeared, and I stared at the granite, waiting for an answer, but none came. Suddenly, I felt as if Belghais Soleimani had felt my hand touching hers. My body, perhaps, also touched hers. Maybe this contact would further transfer something from her to me, and something from me to her in the grave. With no further reflection, I stretched out on the grave, and a damp cold crept into my body. I don't know how long I was in that state when I suddenly felt a ghost standing over me in semi-darkness. Before I could turn my head, the ghost yelled, "Couldn't you find a different place to kill yourself?" I stood up hurriedly. The blue-eyed custodian was standing by Belghais Soleimani's grave, shifting a stick from one hand to another. "Are you crazy? Coming to kill yourself here? Hurry up and get up before I call the police." "I don't want to kill myself. I've come 2 months ago. This woman, that is the Belghais Soleimani in the grave, said the same thing. I've called the police anyway. They'll be here soon." "Sir, listen, this woman has the same name as me. The blue-eyed man raised his stick, and I got moving. In the time it took us to reach his office, I told him everything I needed about Belghais, Naji's neighbor. He didn't either understand or didn't want to understand. In his office, he ordered me to stick my finger down my throat, throw up what he assumed I had swallowed in order to kill myself. While we waited for the police, I said my piece, and the blue-eyed custodian his. Unlike the custodian, the young captain who arrived believed me after looking at my driver's license and Belghais Soleimani's tomb next to Naji's, although he failed to conceal from me and the custodian the fear marking his features and his hurried steps. The captain did not wait for me to leave, but the custodian stood menacingly by the entrance of the cemetery, giving me a look of revulsion until I disappeared from view. I was not far from Lahijan when I smelled dirt and felt someone's presence in my car. That's the end of the Dastanak. In a twist to the motif of the doppelganger, in Soleimani's story, it's the living that seeks her double. If the appearance of one's double implies one's imminent death, in Soleimani's story, it is the double who is summoned from beyond the grave and who seems to be interested in joining the living, as the ending suggests. The other Belghais Soleimani, whose suicide remains unexplained, the story's ending suggests, could well accompany the narrator perennially. We don't know. What the visit to the cemetery offers is an opening to a realm of existence in which the narrator is no longer the only Belghais Soleimani. To draw on Aaron Dorfman's work, Double Trouble, that's the title of his book, this manifestation of the double is not merely an invocation of an alter ego. I quote from Dorfman, "It incarnates the inevitable reminder and opaque element of singular subjectivity and stable self-identity, connecting them to other beings and identities. The double is what defies unicity and opens up the subject to multiplicity, since it reveals that the boundaries between I and the world, I and the other, I and me, are far from clear. End of quote. This multiplicity is reflected in the title of the story, where the I of the narrator is distinct from Belghis Soleimani, as if the living author is a different subject from the woman buried in Lahijan. While the title invokes is the difficulty of embodying Belghis Soleimani without acknowledging her other, who remains a mysterious apparition, but whose existence is in no doubt. Yet remarkably, the narrator does not appear to experience fear, as does, for instance, the police officer, who's shaken when he verifies that her name is indeed, the narrator's name is indeed Belghis Soleimani. This possibility that the name Belghis Soleimani is not attached to a singular person and the apparition's appearance in the car suggests, as we are reminded by Dorfman, that there are multiple ways in which a subject exists in the world, and that our constructed selves are always in flux and circulate relationally. This relationality, to return to Judith Butler's giving account of oneself, is not without ethical valences. Let me quote from Butler again. When the I seeks to give account of itself, it can start with itself, but will find that that self is implicated in a social temporality that exceeds its own capacities for narration. Indeed, when the I seeks to give an account of itself, an account that must include the conditions of its own emergence, it must, as a matter of necessity, become a social theorist. The reason for this is that the I has no story of its own that is not also the story of a relation or a set of relations or a set of norms. Although many contemporary critics worry that this means there is no concept of the subject that can serve as the ground for moral agency and moral accountability, that conclusion does not follow. The I is always, to some extent, dispossessed by the social conditions of its emergence. On the contrary, it may well be the condition for moral inquiry, end of quote. I've included this passage from Butler to allay possible concerns about how we might loosen the hold on Iranian women's subjectivity and their accountability on ethical grounds. What I'd like to emphasize instead is the possibility that the fictional worlds Iranian women writers create are not unmediated reflections of the social and political realities that condition what they create. This does not mean that their fictional worlds are devoid of ethical or moral concerns, but rather that they, the writers themselves, cannot be expected to offer explicit answers to our questions about how they view women's lot in contemporary Iranian society. The protagonists of Ruz Khargoosh, Rabbit's Day adopts, are themselves ways of navigating her world, as reflected in the meanings of the title, which only become clear toward the end of the novel. The title refers to the rabbit in a cartoon drawing in a children's magazine Azin used to try to sketch through the maze and get the rabbit to the end, which was a carrot. In the final chapter of the novel, as Azin leaves her boyfriend, Bahram, to drive home, she asks him if he ever was able to trace the rabbit's path to the promised carrot. When he responds negatively, Azin too admits that she had never succeeded in finding the rabbit's path to the carrot. Here we see the promised prize held out but deferred perennially. The rabbit's path to a seemingly unattainable goal could be read, and I'm taking a leap here, as an allegory for the difficulty of navigating women's roles to impossible sets of expectations, norms, and modes of subjectivity. Azin, like the rabbit in the maze, awaits an illusory fulfillment in whose absence she creates fictional selves to navigate the tortuous path of an overburdened category of identity as woman. I'd like to now turn briefly, I'm coming to the end, briefly to a short story about Ferishte Ahmadi, entitled Saray Hame, Everyone's Sarah. The story revolves around the life of a married couple, Shahrzad and Amir. It appears at first that Amir is having, as we read the story, Amir is having an affair with another woman named Sarah. But we discover that Sarah is, I'm going to have to learn to pronounce it one way or another. I keep saying Sarah and Sarah. But Sarah is none other than Shahrzad in an assumed double identity that allows her to be both Amir's wife and mistress. The role-playing Shahrzad insists on is fairly elaborate. She demands that they each play their role as if Sarah were an entirely different person. The pretense becomes unbearable to Amir, and after their agreed-upon period of 4 months of shuttling between Shahrzad and Sarah, he announces one day that he has decided to divorce Shahrzad in order to marry Sarah, the fictional one. Shahrzad's reaction is far from favorable, and she insists that they need to continue with their role-playing. The story's emphasis on Shahrzad's desire and need to live as if she can exist as two different women is not unlike Azin's various personas, defying the strictures that attend any one embodiment of female identity. Shahrzad's insistence on shuttling between the wife and the mistress could be read as an allusion to the fact that Iranian men can have multiple wives while women are circumscribed by their gender. Her refusal to abandon one role in favor of another, albeit detached from the reality that there is no Sarah, leaves Amir's predicament unresolved. Shahrzad tells him that his insistence on abandoning the role-playing has killed not only her Sarah, but everyone's Sarah, and on whose an imaginary Sarah on whom she projects her desired characteristics, or whatever other people might want to project onto it. As she drifts into sleep, Amir asks her who she is, because he thinks, okay, maybe I've settled this. And she refuses to grant the reader and Amir an ending to the role-playing. She says her last name is Siamak, an adopted fake name for Sarah. Ferishte Sari's story refuses to give us an ending to the role-playing. Somewhere along the way, the role-playing has taken on a reality of its own, foreclosing on the possibility of Shahrzad returning to her former delimited identity, or as she claims in the story, to return to the tedium of their prior lives as husband and wife. You can see why the ambivalences in the fictional examples I've cited would be seen as signs of failure for authors to provide clear and decisive messages about their political views on the world they inhabit. I'm sure that I've not provided better answers to the question my question my colleague asked about Belghei Soleimani's possible relation to Qasem Soleimani. The answer with which Foucault ends his essay, what difference does it make who's speaking, will certainly not resolve the dilemma of authorship in the context of Iranian women's writing today. I would suggest, however, that the works demand that we read them not as ways of pinpointing the writer's political beliefs and affiliations or filiations, but rather to lead us through a maze of ambiguities that are part and parcel of the fractious and discordant realities of contemporary Iran. In the meantime, we will have to wait the day the rabbit reaches the promised carrot and finds the carrot to have been worth the effort. Iranian women have been led to believe in the promise of a so-called secular nationalist or an Islamist vision of deliverance from subservience. Faced with the abject failure of either vision, their fictional creations can hardly be expected to offer a blueprint for liberation from a misogyny that continues to ask women why they don't speak truth to power. As readers of Iranian women's fiction, our role is not, I would suggest, to wish away ambivalences, but rather to lean into them to understand the realities they create through their fiction. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So I'm in charge of the Q&A, and as is the tradition, I will use this privilege perhaps to ask a first question while you're refining your own question. So I will start with something I think very simple and maybe even simplistic, but we have to start somewhere. And actually, you sort of started providing an answer in your conclusion. You mentioned towards the beginning of your talk censorship, and you also mentioned the burden of representation and the expectations of readers outside Iran today, and especially among the diaspora. And so, as I was thinking about questions, one almost mechanical comment or idea came to my mind. Said, okay, so is this multiplicity and this playfulness with identities that you described, should we see this, or is it too mechanical to put this in relation precisely with censorship? And I'm hesitant to say that because I am realizing I'm saying something stupid in a way.
No, you're not.
No, but because probably providing an occasion but could it be a starting point for something to see some sort of intentionality, going back to in the use of this playfulness and those multiple persona in the fiction itself? And sorry, I don't want to take too much time, but it also made me think about another thing. Because so these days I'm reading Romain Gary's novels, and of course I couldn't help but think about someone who was so playful about identities, his own identity, in the identities of his characters in his own novels, in troubled times, and so his purpose was clearly not to go around some sort of censorship or anything, and had to do with things that are more fundamental, and then turn to what you were saying about. And it raises also this question, thinking about strategy, it's also thinking about history, thinking about a specific moment, and you kept doing this back and forth between fundamental observations about fiction, decontextualized in a way, and these specific historical context. So that's not a question as such, but you see where I'm going, and I will just...
No, those are incredibly important points, and I think that in relation to censorship, actually, it's very interesting because already in the wake of the revolution, a number of women writers began using what was described or can be described as magical realist forms of writing as a way of moving between the different planes of reality. So if you wanted to pin something down on this and say this is not appropriate, but even then the censors really seem to be able to fixate on things. The best example is Sharnush Parsipour's Women Without Men. It was published, released, fine. And then the minute they realized, whoops, there's something here that we should have, they revoked the permission and she was thrown in jail. I do think that we can't, the reason I mentioned censorship is we've never gotten away from it. Under the Shah, there were particular lists of things that had to be avoided for the books to pass through censor. And in the Islamic Republic, they're no different. They have their own priorities and what might be construed as offensive, unacceptable, and so on. When I was, for instance, I am rather working with a publisher in Iran who wants to publish the Azrai Khalwat Nishin, Taqi Modarisi's last novel in Persian. He sent me a list from Wizrat Irshad, what do you call it, the Ministry of Culture, whatever, and said, these words must be struck out. And so they're very precise things. But when I thought about what would it be like, I was trying to channel Taqi Modarisi. How would he have responded? Would he have wanted people in Iran to read this novel as opposed to not having permission to publish it? I think that censorship is both the bane of the writer's lives, but also gives them an opportunity to be playful. Mm-hmm. And that playfulness itself is, I think, is productive and should be explored. Because we think of censorship, or at least the way I have seen censorship analyzed in the context of the Iranian writing, is always like, woo, there's the line, if you cross this one. Whereas there are things published that you wonder, did the censors not catch this? So there is this game of cat and mouse writers are playing with censors. And I don't want to discount that. I think that is itself, if we could analyze it not as this simple top-down, we tell you, but rather the navigation around these things, I think it could be a very insightful thing.
Yeah, we're probably back to fundamental things about writing and fiction when we do that. Because,
that's right. That's right. Now, one of the things that Belghe Soleimani, which I find bold in Belghe Soleimani's work, is she writes about the 1980s and the mass arrests and executions. She writes about it in a way that I have not seen, at least maybe I've missed things, but I have not seen other writers tackle. And when the response that in fiction is produced, she also gives in an interview, and they say to her, are you going to ever move on from the 1980s? And she gives a similar answer. I can't move on because I'm stuck. In other words, we haven't dealt with that trauma. You know? So for her, the reality is very concrete, so I don't want to discount that. I think that there's a way in which she says, my generation has been shaped not only by the war, but the executions and the mass arrests. In fact, one of the novels is about this character who, in the moment where they're coming to arrest anyone who was affiliated or believed to be affiliated with the Mujahideen Khalq, this guy escapes and goes to his village. And his parents don't know what to do with him because if they keep him in the house, it'll be obvious. So they put him in the stable. And he lives in that stable. He digs a little hole so he can go and sleep in it if he thinks that someone might be coming. But what she does with that is she makes the inhumanity of what has been done to someone like this protagonist, for us, incredibly palpable. Because I've never read a novel that's given me so much sort of an allergic reaction, because I could, every time he talks about, oh, the fleas are crawling up my leg or so. So she delves in very deeply into those concrete realities. So I want to also bring that up and say that she's struggling and she is working through some of these traumas. Whether she's related to Qasem Soleimani or not, it doesn't matter. What matters to me is that she brings to life what interviewers want her to forget, what readers want her to, move on. Whereas she's stuck in that reality. So these were turbulent times. I'm not answering you, but I'm coming around. Yeah, the comment is that it is very much, the realities that they have lived are very much constitutive of the kind of fiction they create. And that there was and there still is, a lot of experimental fiction. I'm really interested in the genre of flash fiction, for instance. Why is it suddenly so popular? Because it offers these possibilities of almost like, moments that you can capture a moment and then let it go. So I'm still struggling with some of these things. But you gave me lots to think about. Thank you.
So the floor is open.
Thank you so much for this brilliant talk. I learned a lot. I got so many ideas. I was wondering, can the writer, the women writer, most specifically, entering the character in their story, if you could talk about it a bit more, and whether this is something that you have seen only in women's writing or also in men's writing. And for example, we see it in Soleimani, in Sined Danishvar's Island trilogy, in Sined Rahani's What Did I Buy With My Heart, that she writes the whole story about herself and her being the character. And so I was wondering if you could talk about it a bit. I mean, we have some writers like Ulrich Haraki who writes in a, the main character, the narrator is a man, but I just wanted to know if that could be specifically considered as a, characteristic of women's writers or not.
Excellent question. I've been so focused on women writers, I can't really think of an example. Maybe this diaspora writer in Holland, who does a thing that is similar to what Simin Danishvar and others do, which is that it sort of becomes a character in the narrative, right? Ghader Abdullah is his name, I think. He's been translated, at least one of his works has been translated into English. But that's the only example I can think of. But it's an interesting thing that, we have the examples that you have given. If that is, I don't know. I can't theorize it because I don't have enough, kind of wide enough scope here to see. I mean, autofiction or elements of writers' or biographies and their lived experiences do show up in their fiction. It's, for me, at least, maybe because I don't know enough, but I think that this playfulness is key to what I think is the start of something. I don't quite know if I can say that all women writers do it, because certainly, we have writers who really write in a different mode and different genres, but it could be something to pursue.
So you mentioned the first story set in the graveyard. You translated this, right? It had the word festoon. I like this word, by the way. But I guess my question has to do with the rebuttal that it's playing with identity and putting on different suits in a way just as fixated on identity as the activists we visited, and is the role of the translator in a way a liberation from that. There's a question about translation, not about literature, but my own impression from listening to the talk is the truly liberating thing isn't the part of putting on different identities and pretending to be this person, but disappearing and being a conduit for someone else's writing to flow through you. Does that sync with your attitude towards translation, or do you completely disagree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes. I love translation we have a wonderful translator, a dedicated translator here. For me, yes, it is an experience in which I know in the moment of translation that I'm making choices that if I checked with the author, they would probably shoot me. But, because I'm liberated from those certainties. I mean, I haven't been able to go back and look at my own translations because every time you look at a translation, you start thinking, oh, why did I choose that word instead of, like you said, festooned. For me, that came right out of an image of growing up on the Caspian Sea, and there were all these brambles and so on that we went and played in. But I think that, yeah, as a translator, I'm thinking particularly of Doug Robinson, who has written about he has a great number of books on translation, theories of translation, what translators do. One of the things I like about his work and when I discovered it and when I talked to him about it is the somatic act of, the experience that you have as a translator sitting there. There's a tremendous amount of anxiety, but the text produces something in you, right? And for it to flow through you, you have to also experience those many different subjectivities, yeah. And the many potentialities that a text might have. Did that answer your question?
I guess the second half.
Yes, please.
I'm not sure about the rebuttal, the part about is it kind of just as fixated on identity to put on different identities? Aren't those both products of some very modern sort of me-focused, I don't know, something about it made me think they're two sides of the same coin, but I'm not sure if you disagree.
No, I don't disagree. I think that it is a way of obfuscating and getting away from a fixed identity, but the question constantly, the mere fact that I'm writing this and presenting this is that it comes back to the fixation on identity, which I'd like to displace, but it's also a bit of a pipe dream. I know. It's an uphill battle for me to argue this because ultimately it does come back to the identity.
Yeah, so thank you for your talk. And what you said at the beginning about this expectation that you've encountered or expectation and disappointment that not all Iranian women writers are addressing or directly addressing the status of women in Iran.
Made you think, at least when I kind of became conscious let's say, about the world in the late 80s, early 90s, books, starting with Not Without My Daughter, and these kind of books about Iranian women being oppressed was like the crack cocaine for middle-aged white women. And they just couldn't get enough of it. And even some of my teachers had read this, and I was the only remotely similar person in the class, so I got it all, like from 30 years onwards, like Ahmed has to suffer for those things. But how do you deal? First of all, is that still something that you encounter in your teaching? And how do you deal with, how do you kind of rescue these writers from just being these kind of one-trick ponies that are you now speaking about female oppression in Iran, or otherwise you have nothing interesting to say? I mean, how do you deal with it as an educator and as a writer?
That's an excellent question. In the classroom, when I used to teach a lot more undergraduate students, this kind of question always comes up. And sometimes it comes from the students' excitement about encountering something, and say, wow, I thought all women in Iran were oppressed. Oh, they're right. Or they do. And it drives me crazy, of course. But in the classroom, I try to focus their attention on wait. You've just started reading. And you're coming at this question from your perspective that is very much influenced by the media. I'm thinking of Edward Said's Covering Islam. Beginning with the hostage crisis, everybody's riveted to the television. What is happening? What is the latest thing that happens? And the minute by minute things happening in Iran. And that fixation on the part of a lot of people still exists. And partly because we don't have relations with Iran, particularly in this country, I find it really sometimes in undergraduate classes quite a dilemma. I'll give you one example I had. I was teaching a course on Iranian poetry as manifests itself in cinema. So sort of that. And we started with Furu Farrokhzad's House, The House is Black, which is about a leper colony. It's very poetic. She writes poetry. She uses Old Testament quotations, and she does her own voiceover. And then we proceeded to see other films. It wasn't just on Iranian women. But I'd given the students the option of, sorry to give you a long-winded answer, but I'd given each student the option of doing a class presentation on a film of their own choice. And they came up with amazing things. But one student really stood out. She came to me, and she was very shy at first, but she said, listen, I want to show a film that is different. And I said, what? Different is good. Show it. She said, well, it's just short. And it turned out it was a newsreel of the last Shah's coronation. And I asked her, oh, why that? How did you choose that? Because, what you're doing in this class is giving everyone the impression that we're all backward. This is a young Iranian-American woman. And I really, inside I was boiling, but I just said, well, that's no way to act. So I said to her, you know what? You do exactly what you want to do. Do the same thing that I ask every other student, to please contextualize it. Tell us why you chose this, what it is in it that is important to you. And she was happy. And I said, where did you get this idea for this? Well, my father. My father told me your teacher is really poisoning everybody's minds about Iran. Okay, so she showed this, she provided her context, and then I just stood back. The students themselves in the class raised their hand and said, wasn't the coronation, what year was that? And didn't Furu Farrokhzad make the leper colony film? If things were so wonderful, why were lepers in such dire conditions? So in that context, my job was easier because the students were engaging with each other to say, wait a minute, you think this is the glorious Iran of pre-revolution? Look at this. We looked at this film, we analyzed it. But it's a constant rejoinder, students, even when they approach me as an instructor, as like how pleased they are that they're reading something. Like Uncle Napoleon is one of the novels I've taught. Wow, this is amazing. Or, a woman writer's work or something. It is always this kind of embedded image that Iran must be this awful place, that we have to dispel that, right? Everything is not about the theocracy, and people, as we see in their daily lives, even in the Islamic Republic, they they find ways around, and people live their lives, right? But it's a challenge for teaching. There was another part of your question. That was it.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I was really sort of struck and appreciated just the way you showed that these writers, these women writers, are themselves problematizing this rather narrow aspect of the reading culture, the kind of reading practices that demand this sort of fixed meaning and sort of transparent political commentary through meditations on the theme of identity. And it just got me wondering, or just out of ignorance, whether you see any other strategies that they're employing to try and change the reading culture, try and sort of valorize ambiguity, because it strikes me, in the Persian tradition, going back centuries, ambiguity was a very big part of the reading practice, and also playing games with your writerly identity through the tahallos, through the kind of persona of who you are as a writer, saying, this is who I am, but it's also not who I am. So I wonder if you see them drawing on any aspects of that, pre-modern tradition, the pre-modern reading culture that maybe allows for a greater degree of ambiguity in some ways, in any of the writers you mentioned or other contemporary fiction, and sort of on the other side of that, something that came out as well from your talk was how they're experimenting with different literary forms. You have autofiction, Dostoevsky, short stories, novels, all sorts of things. So how kind of literary form comes into this mission that you kind of are suggesting they have of trying to improve the reading culture, basically. If that's not.
What an excellent question. I mean, a great comment. I can't think of any one of these writers does Stephen Danishar do that at all? That draws on the early modern traditions, which are so wonderful ways of engaging with your audience, but also as you say in Tahallos, I am this, but I'm not this, right? I don't see it, at least in clear allusions and references. But you've given me something to think about now, which is that those reading practices that have been, in a way, I'm going to blame the monarchy for this, but no, not really, I'm joking, is that those reading practices which had within them all the seeds for ambivalences, ambiguities, and playfulness have been cast aside in the interest of reading for politics, right? I've seen, for instance, the counterexample is, I don't know if I'm old enough that I remember this, but Ahmad Shamlou, one of our renowned poets, when he chose to speak about the Shahnameh at Berkeley, and he was so controversial in this, because he was taking, and this is the counterexample I have in mind, he was taking this huge magnum opus with lots of complexities of myth, history, you name it, in there, poetics, everything, and reducing it to this is where oppression is, like circling it. That is for me that distillation of this desire that came from what I called the conflation of the writer, poet with intellectual. I remember a discussion which the Tari Modarisi said, listen, people in the US are writers. Nobody comes and asks them to save the world by writing. Of course, things have changed now. But that desire to see it wasn't even so much the desire to see the writer, it's the writer's own feeling their mission being that. I think has taken some of that complexity away. And I do think that these works of fiction, which I enjoy tremendously, including what Frank translated, right? I was way up here. So they're trying to move us. This is my thesis, of course. They're moving us to different ways of reading. It's almost not relevant, as if they're saying, who cares who's married to whom? Who cares who does this? The product is this. Or is in a scene in the novel where Azine asks Belghay Soleimani, the writer, well, do you think your novel failed? And she says, I don't know, it's for you to decide. That itself is a comment on, you are the recipient of this thing I've created. You delve in it. You will find what you will find. I hope that's the trend, because wouldn't it be great if we could recapture those earlier moments?